Saltwater Magic. Written and narrated by Timothy J. R. Raines. Chapter 1. Far under the ocean, Tamurot squealed with dark delight as she darted among the seafloor chasms. Over the black reef she spiraled, her silvery tail flashing in the gloom. Sea devils and lancetfish scattered from her presence. Not even Leviathan would loiter long before the goddess of the deep. Streaming upright, Tamurot lingered at the mouth of a murky cavern. She gazed out into the watery abyss, stroking the repulsive length of her seaweed hair as she squirmed with anticipation. At long last, the hour would soon arrive. All this time she had been waiting in lustful agony as the shoreline receded year by excruciating year, and her power swelled in the tiniest of increments with each wave that crashed against the coast. Her strength and territory were growing a little at a time. It was slow warfare, a battle of inches, but she was slowly regaining the ground her most hated foe had wrestled away from her. Suor, the river god, that freshwater farce of a deity. The very name made her recoil in disgust. The irrigation god, she called him, for he gave life to the land and its creatures, watering the forests, valleys, and plains with his placid lakes and trickling brooks. It was Suor who made the rain to fall, showering the earth so that crops could grow and humans could prosper. Humans were his chiefest creations, and he loved their worship of him. With the goddess Umatari, he had even had a son, Belshuar, who had dwelt among the humans as a man, and had taken a human queen in the great marriage of heaven and earth, which had lasted for 1,000 unbearable years. In those days she had trembled in terror and hid in the darkest depths of the ocean, while men and women sailed, fished, and swam among her green waves without fear of her or her minions. But no longer. Belshuar had gone away. There had not been a god-king among the humans for several millennia, and in that time Tamurot had slithered back from the brink of annihilation. Where she was once a byword among even the lowliest, most impotent sea creatures, the demons of the sea now shuddered under her command. It had taken many sacrifices. How many ships had she torn asunder with her fierce waves, or lured into the rocks with her mesmerizing voice? How many lovelorn sailors had she dragged into the deep? How many young boys, foolish and brave enough to die for pearls among her reefs, had her gray-skinned knights ripped apart in boiling crimson? The lives she'd snuffed out were as innumerable as the shells along the shore. Now the humans feared the name of Tamurot. Some even worshipped her in secret. Fishermen, sailors, outcasts whom society had marginalized, though their prayers and paltry offerings were not born out of love, but of terror and hate. Their devotion was repugnant to her, but useful, and she rewarded those who served her well. After all, she was confined to the sea. She was powerless on land, and the freshwater currents of her enemy were antithetical to her existence. But, after an aeon of brooding, she had devised a plan by which her human proselytes could help her overcome that frustrating obstacle and swallow up all of Suor's territory, lake, river, forest, and mountain. A school of bubbles burst from her long teeth and escaped to the surface, and a tinny echo warbled through the deep as the sea goddess giggled like an infatuated girl. Her naked bosom heaved as she rolled onto her back and twisted her slimy locks into a revolting braid with nimble corpse-gray fingers. Like two amphibious fireflies, her eyes glared with a pinkish light, casting an infernal luminance on the ocean floorscape. Her son would soon be born. Chapter 2. 6 flat-bottomed boats drifted among the darkening mangroves, drawn through the pungent, smacking waters by strong men with long-poled oars. Pink flames shivered in lanterns hung from each boat, lighting the way through the gray dusk and warding off the buzzing swarms with magical incandescence. Night was falling, and the croaking of monstrous bullfrogs rose to greater intensity. A deep growl rumbled from the dark tangle of mangrove roots. Her green eyes tense with fear, a slender, dark-haired girl watched from one of the boats for movement in the shadows. Having come from the royal city of Visala, where she served as priestess in training at the altar of Suor, she was accustomed to the comforts of civilization. But since first light, the boatmen had taken her deeper and deeper into this accursed swamp. She had not gotten used to its putrid stink and wild, terrifying creatures. She shuddered as she heard the growl again. Lazar called cheerfully from the boat beside her. "Sister Caga, don't worry. He's just reminding you to keep your hands inside the vessel." Caga squeezed her hands together in her lap. "See, you're fine," he said. "It's just a pleasant boat ride. No need to worry." He flashed the charming grin that had immediately disarmed her when she and her companions first arrived in the village of Caradon. Lazar was Caradon's chief elder. He was a lively man with a sharp wit and impeccable posture. His very oar strokes seemed to emanate heroic leadership. He was darkly tanned, silver-haired, and though he had daughters who were the same age as Caga, he flirted with her constantly. As a temple virgin, Caga was unused to receiving this sort of attention from a man. She had quickly found herself trusting him completely. She had hoped to travel in the same boat as Lazar, but Mashti had insisted that she go with her and Father Sakazar. The fierce and muscular warrior woman's single task was to safeguard Caga's purity against the wiles of such men, and she had already given Lazar several warnings. However, Mashti tended to be a bit extreme, and even Father Sakazar, Caga's kind and gentle mentor, who had come to witness the completion of her vigil and consecrate her as a full-fledged priestess, exercised added caution around the temple bruiser. Of course, the disarming effect of Lazar's flirtatiousness was all but lost on Caga in the middle of the swamp. Another growl rumbled from the dark, this time more ferocious, and Caga hummed loudly as a long, black form sloshed into the water. "What was that?" Mashti asked. Lazar shrugged and dipped his oar. "Just a crocodile. It's okay." But since the sun had begun to set, the other men had grown quiet. They were on edge. Hamad, the one-legged man at the stern of Lazar's vessel, seemed particularly tense. He was feverishly pale, and his black curls were stuck to his sweaty forehead. He had practically jumped out of his skin at the sound of swishing water. Hamad was the former guard captain of Caradon and Lazar's son-in-law. Supposedly, he had once been a man of tremendous courage. Now he was a spineless, cowering milksop and had lost the respect of all the men in the village. Not least of all, Lazar. Caga noticed he had the curious habit of scratching his missing knee. "Crocodiles are one thing," huffed Father Sakazar, weary from hours of paddling. "But we've come an awfully long way. I can smell the salt water. If we go much further, we'll be swept out to sea." "That's right," said Lazar. "This swamp is a salt marsh fed by many estuaries. Fresh water and salt water mingle here, where the rivers from the high ground run into the tidal waters." "They built a temple in salt water?" Caga asked in disbelief. Lazar chuckled. "No. Well, it's brackish water now, but it would have been fresh water when they built it ages and ages ago. Over the centuries, the shoreline has receded. Tamurot has slowly been reclaiming her territory. The last statement made Father Sakazar uneasy, and he shook his head. I am liking this less and less. Oh, it's quite safe, I can assure you. I come out here every couple of months to offer up the prayers of my people. There is nothing to worry about. Are there crocodiles inside the temple? Asked Mashti. Caga turned white. No, there aren't crocodiles inside the temple, Azar laughed. We've made sure of that. By Umatari, you city folk are a nervous bunch. Though the heat was stifling, Caga wrung her hands as if she were cold. Are we nearly there? Yes, we've just arrived. Look. In the last glint of the setting sun, a black mass loomed over the treetops, the peak of a shadow-enshrouded ziggurat. The sight of it made Caga shiver. She was to spend the entire night alone in this colossal ruin? The mangroves parted as they came nearer, and the temple seemed to swell from the swamp like a growing shadow. A flight of vine-entangled steps cleft from green stone ascended to the high top of the ziggurat. At the bottom of the steps there was a landing, but as the boats drifted closer, Caga's heart skipped and pounded furiously in her chest. Dark, serrated forms were draped over the landing, and a dozen reptilian eyes gleamed in the pinkish light. Lazar drew his pole from the water. Reaching into a leather bag, he withdrew something like a skinned rabbit. He whirled it twice over his head and flung far out into the dark. It splashed unseen, and two of the black forms snarled and slithered into the water. The sudden snap of vicious jaws and a terrible thrashing sent a ripple of waves against the boat. Caga felt her courage wilting as the primal aggression reverberated through the bottom boards. There was a quiet whimper in the boat next to her, and heavy, rapid breathing. Hamad was tensed up like a steel spring. Tears ran down his cheeks from adrenaline-wired eyes. Lazar hurled several more carcasses into the dark, until the landing was clear of the fearsome creatures. Then two of the boats drew up along either side of the landing, and Lazar directed Mashti and Father Sakazar to pull up to it crosswise, so that the boats enclosed the landing on all three sides. This done, the other three boats did the same, forming a second square around the first, with the village men holding the bobbing vessels tight together. Lazar hopped from his boat onto the landing. The bottom few steps had been cleft from the stairway to prevent the crocodiles and other swamp creatures from entering the temple. His curved sword clinked faintly at his side as he leapt up and pulled himself onto the first step with nimble athleticism. Rising, he gestured to the landing. Sister Caga! Caga hung her gourd of drinking water around her neck and took up her gold trinketed staff from the bottom of the boat. She stood up, trembling, and nearly lost her balance as she stepped out of the rocking craft. The landing was submerged in 2 inches of swishing swamp water, and it washed over her sandaled feet and dampened the grey hem of her gown as she waited at the bottom of the stairs. With his staff and a lantern, Father Sakazar stepped out after her and stood for a moment with his head bowed and his eyes shut tight. Lantern light danced on his bald scalp and illumined every crease in his knitted brow. He was troubled. He did not like leaving her alone in the middle of the swamp. He lifted his head, his eyes still closed, and sighed deeply. Sister Kagarashti, he began, Suor be with you, and Umatari be with you. Another moment passed in silence before Father Sakazar moved into the succession of prayers, collects, and exhortations that initiated her vigil, which in the morning would be concluded with the rite of her consecration. As he spoke, Caga glanced at Mashti, who watched sternly from the boat, and then at a long snake as it dropped from a low branch into the water and slithered away into the dark. A chill raced up her spine as an inhuman scream rang out from the vast blackness over the swamp. Father Sakazar paused for a moment, then began a chant in clear tenor. Caga joined him, singing harmony, her stomach tight with nervous dread. When they finished the chant, Father Sakazar passed her the lantern, and Lazar stooped down and lifted her effortlessly up onto the first step. He squeezed her hand. There was that grin again. "Ah, how it pains me to leave a gentle soul alone among these ruins," he said. "But with Suor's blessing, the night will pass faster than you think." Caga wasn't so sure, and she drew in an anxious breath as Lazar hopped back down to the landing. Cold tendrils of fear were already creeping in around the edges of her mind. "We should keep going," said Lazar. "The shelter is still another 2 miles. He turned to Caga. "We will be back to fetch you first thing in the morning." "At the very crack of dawn," said Father Sakazar, climbing back into the boat. "Suor be with you." Chapter 3. Caga fought the urge to panic as the boats pushed off from the landing and the pink glow of the lanterns faded into the dark. Now she was alone. Though not truly. A choir of noises filled the swamp that spoke of many nighttime creatures stalking among the reeds and mangroves. She stiffened as water sloshed somewhere in the black nocturnal heat, and a damp chill washed up her back. She turned and began a long ascent to the top of the ziggurat, frequently glancing over her shoulder. She was panting by the time she reached the summit, and her thin gown clung to her supple form. She lifted the gourd and gulped a mouthful of cool water. From that high place, Caga looked out over the vast swaths of shadow. From behind a bluish veil, the crescent moon glimmered eerily in the serpentine waters. Far off in the distance, the slithering silver maze converged into a single shimmering expanse. The ocean sea. The flat top of the ziggurat was sheltered by a pyramid-shaped roof supported by enormous greenstone pillars. A large hole gaped from the floor, where more crumbling green steps spiraled down into the temple. Caga held up the lantern and peered down the winding stairs. The pinkish light did not allow her to see to the bottom, and she shivered as a hollow groan echoed up from the dark shaft. Whispering a prayer to the river god, she began her descent, the butt of her staff clacking loudly on the ancient stone. Suddenly, a chirping flock of winged shadows fluttered up from the darkness, and she cried out and threw herself against the wall. She sighed deeply, clutching her rattled heart as they flapped off into the night. It was a camp of fruit bats, and aside from scaring her senseless, they were no more of a bother to her than the buzzing swarms that hovered around the lantern. But, as she worked up the nerve to continue on, Caga could not help wondering what else might lurk in the depths of Suor's temple. At the bottom of the stairs, 4 open archways led from the stairwell in different directions, all of which led into a vast main chamber. She could not see to either end, nor could she see the top of the high vaulted ceilings. She followed the sound of trickling water and came to where 2 streams flowed from the walls and joined in a single, larger channel. It would lead her to the altar, where she would pass the night in prayerful meditation. There, as in all the temples of the river god, the altar would be surrounded by fruit trees and rich foliage. This greenery would be fed by a pure freshwater pool, and its bright flowers and lush leaves would be blessed by rays of sun, which at dawn would stream through high gaps in the temple. But, as Caga came to the edge of the pool, she buried her face in the crook of her arm. The pungent stink that pervaded the whole of the swamp had suddenly become thicker and more putrid. A great reluctance came over her as she looked at the still, black water glistening in the lantern light. The pool of the divine altar should not smell the way these waters did. Caga swallowed hard. It was her sacred duty to keep vigil at the altar, and though her senses screamed in protest, she dipped her foot into the pool, descended the slime-slick steps, and waded up to her waist in the warm, dark water. Her nerves high-strung, her eyes peeled wide, she watched the rippling surface for black-ridged forms drifting towards her, her ears tuned for the guttural snarls that might at any second resound throughout the altar room in anticipation of her horrible demise. But all she could hear was the throbbing of her own heart and the quiet swish of lapping water as the pool ebbed and swelled with the subtle rising of the tide. Green slime coated the steps ascending the platform, and rather than trees and lush vegetation, thick wads of seaweed were strewn before the altar. Caga's heart pounded in her ears. Suor might once have been worshipped in this temple, but no longer. Whatever thing was now honored in this corrupted site was as foul as the heavy stench that lingered here. Caga approached the altar, her supple form braced tense in preparation of what evil she might find. The altar was bare, but something glistened in the dark beyond it. Slowly, she lifted the lantern, and with dreadful realization, she knew it was not her own heart beating in her eardrums. From the wall beyond the altar bulged a throbbing mass of orange gel. Her hair bristled on the back of her neck. Her dark skin crawled between her shoulder blades, and her cold lips quivered in silent terror as the whole altar room seemed to pulsate with unholy life. Then, a movement from within the gel caused her to find her voice, and her shrill shriek rang out among the dark chambers beneath the ziggurat. A webbed hand had reached out from the membrane. Chapter 4. The shelter was a treehouse built high in the mangroves. A rope ladder dangled from the dark heights, and as the boats drifted beneath it, Lazar reached for the bottom rungs. Father Sakazar watched him shimmy up the ladder with a lantern. The pink glow disappeared as he lifted himself through a trap door, and a moment later he called down that it was safe to come up. Father Sakazar climbed up after Hamad, whose nervous exertions caused the ladder to jerk and sway. After him came Mashti and the other men of Caradon, bringing up the lanterns and sacks of supplies. "Here we are," Lazar said, as the last of the village men drew themselves up through the floor. "Come, put aside your worry for the young sister. She's in Suor's hands now. The night will be long for her, but in the morning she will be fine. In the meantime, since you are so anxious for her sake, why not calm your nerves with some sweet Mirapolin wine?" The muscle-bound woman grunted at this suggestion. "It seems foolish to me that we should dull our wits with drink while there is so much danger about us." Lazar laughed. "You tense city folk. Very well, water for the sister's guardian." "And for me as well," said Father Sakazar. "I think I would prefer to keep my mind sharp. But thank you." But of course, my friend. Tell me though, do you like spicy food? We of the marshlands love the red sativa pepper. It will put a fire in your mouth and pour hot coals in your belly. Your lips will still be stinging in the morning, but you will sweat your worry out. Though perhaps your Visalan palates are too delicate for such strong fare. I could have something else made, something less potent." Father Sakazar smirked and held up his hand. "I am no stranger to the red sativa pepper. I do enjoy a fearsome dish. Poor Mashti, however." Mashti shrugged. "I'm not hungry." "Nonsense," said Lazar. I'll prepare something for you. There is no shame being unable to withstand the red sativa pepper's heat. I'll make you something nice, something that will help you stay alert, since I suspect you intend to stay awake." She nodded. "I will sleep when I have returned Sister Caga safely to Visala as a consecrated priestess of Suor. But if you would kindly make me something I could eat that won't dissolve my insides, I would greatly appreciate it." "Of course," chuckled the Tsar, fetching a small pot and squatting with 2 other men as they built a fire. Though the 2 visitors from Visala had not partaken in the wine, the men of Caradon gulped it freely from large jugs, and after they had devoured the fiery stew, they quickly fell into a deep sleep. Father Sakazar had been the first to nod off. Then one by one the heads of the village men slumped to their chests, and their heavy snoring filled the treetop shelter. In the corner sat the burly temple chaperone, her knobbed iron club resting against her shoulder. Her tolerance was greater than the others, but even she could not blink off sleep for long. Soon she too closed her eyes. Lazar watched her for some time. Once he was sure she was deep in slumber, he pulled the dark wad of leaves from underneath his tongue. He had laced the stew and wine with purple juice from the Ninda lily. They would sleep well into the morning, until which not even the most violent storm could wake them. He had eaten and drunk himself, but the leaves he had kept under his tongue were from the jago weed, a common herb which grew in abundance near the village of Caradon, and which was widely known to counteract the anesthetic properties of the Ninda lily. Lazar set out at once, trembling with dread. In his haste, he knocked over one of the empty stew pots, sending it clattering across the floor. He swore nervously, freezing in mid-step as he stared at the sleeping men. No one stirred. Fetching a lantern from the wall, he lowered himself through the trapdoor and shimmied down the rope ladder to the boats. But as the pink luminance descended from the treehouse into the swamp, Hamad opened his eyes. Chapter 5. His head spun with gray dizziness, but even in his groggy daze, he was immediately aware that something was not right. Using the wall to support himself, he rose up on his one leg. He fitted his crutch under his arm and hobbled to the trapdoor, where he looked down and saw Lazar sculling away in the direction of the ziggurat. His heart pulsed in alarm, and he looked uneasily to where the temple guardian was slumped snoring in the corner. This was her business. "Mashti," he whispered. "Mashti." He was unable to rouse her. Hamad was reluctant to shake her awake, knowing that if he startled her, she might crush his skull before she fully realized what was taking place. He swallowed hard, then hobbled over and gently nudged her knee. Seeing it had no effect, he gave her a stiff smack with the butt of his crutch, fully expecting her to bolt to her feet with a yell of battle in her throat. But she did not wake. Hamad wasted no time trying to wake the others, for he knew now that they had been drugged with the juice of the Ninda lily. He also knew how a dose that had knocked the heavyweight woman senseless had failed to sedate him. He hurried back to the trapdoor and peered loathingly to where the boats floated in the darkness below. He hated the swamp. He hated even more what lurked in its smacking waters. He knew the murderous aggression of those nocturnal predators more intimately than any other man, and as he reached for the ladder, the cold grip of terror clutched his heart. But his honor as a warrior and former guard captain of Caradon forbade him from doing nothing. Whatever evil beckoned Lazar to the temple must be thwarted. He must keep Sister Caga safe, even at the cost of his life. Hamad swung his one leg onto the first rope rung and began his difficult descent. Once he neared the bottom of the ladder, he prodded the darkness with the butt of his crutch until he knocked against the hard wood of a watercraft, then dropped into the boat below. He had brought no lantern, for Lazar might notice the light behind him. He would trust instead to the moon and starlight. though the going would be truly perilous. Cold sweat formed on his brow as he drew the vessel through the black swamp. He was sick with fear, only heightened by the sluggishness of his drugged mind. His wide eyes darted towards each splash and trickle. Every hollow bump of a gnarled mangrove root made him pant with fright. And once, a sudden squawk and the whoosh of frantic wing beats sent his heart into his throat. At last he came to the ziggurat. Hamad had dreaded finding the black-ridged creatures lounging beneath the steps once again. Without meat, he would be unable to lure them away, and he could not contend with them by force with only his curved sword. But the landing was clear of any creature. A long black boat was moored alongside it. Hamad scrambled out of the vessel and sloshed across the landing with anxious haste. He leapt for the bottom rung, but fell short. He tried again, this time exerting himself with greater focus, but it was too high of a jump for a man with just one leg. He cursed and hopped around to keep his balance. A snarl behind him froze his blood. He knew he was about to hear the awful swashing of a reptilian body and the crushing snap of ferocious jaws that would drag him again into that horrifying death roll. With a surge of primal terror, Hamad sprang from the landing with exceptional force for a one-legged man, clambering onto the step just as the mighty snout clapped shut beneath him. He sat on the stair, whimpering and trembling violently as he glared down at the fearsome predator. His fingers were tingling and his knee was numb, and even in the dark he could see the damp stain around his crotch. Hamad watched the growling crocodile until he could feel his limbs, then started up the ziggurat. The ascent was immensely difficult. There were many steps, and each one must have been 2 feet high. He was wearing himself ragged. He soon gave in to crawling up like an infant, though the going bruised him badly. His breathing was raspy when he finally reached the top. He stood up, wincing as he leaned against a pillar to rest. Moonbeams cast a silvery light onto the summit of the ziggurat, partially illuminating the winding descent into the temple. Hamad shook his head, muttering a curse as he hobbled toward the second set of spiraling steps. He took his time, descending slowly, carefully, supporting himself with the damp rock wall as he tapped his crutch against the steps below. Near the bottom, raised voices echoed from the vast lower chambers. With grim determination, Hamad took out his sword, knowing that if he were to cross blades with the father of his wife, it would likely be his end. A terse shout, followed by the shrill screams of an assaulted woman, ignited his warrior's passion. His blood boiling, he hobbled through the dark chamber as quickly as his one leg would allow. Chapter 6. In the pink glow ahead, he could see their struggling forms. Swearing foully, Lazar seized the screeching would-be priestess by a fistful of her dark curls and shoved her face down onto the altar. The girl's screams rose to a wild shriek as with one brutal wrench of his arm, Lazar tore the gown right off her body. Hamad saw red, and even as he came to the edge of the black pool, he shambled into the glistening waters, without fear of what might lurk within.
"Suor will not forgive you for this, you heretic!" cried Sister Caga as Lazar bound her wrists behind her. "You have betrayed your god! You have betrayed your people!"
"What I do for my people," said Lazar. "Belshuar is gone, but Tamurot is very much alive and real. She is always creeping forward, swallowing up the earth little by little. We shall soon be under the shadow of her dominion. Yet by this very deed I will ensure a place for my people in that terrible reign." He scooped her up and lifted her onto the altar. "I tell you, priestess, there will be a god-king in Visala once again, but it will be no son of Suor."
Caga stared up at him, her green eyes wide with frenzy, as Lazar slid a gleaming dagger from his belt.
"And you, my child," he said, "you shall indeed become a mother of sorts, For your life's blood shall spill over the altar into the pool and nurture our new lord like milk from a swollen breast. This night the son of Tamurot shall be born." "You fool! Do you think the goddess of the deep will reward you? She is treacherous. She will betray you." "I think not," said Lazar. "She and I made a pact where the sea swells around the rocks. We are bound in blood. Not even she can break her word." Caga flung her head back and forth on the altar. "You're out of your mind. You're insane." "No," he said, "and I take no pleasure in what I am about to do. Nevertheless, Sister Kagarashti, prepare yourself." A sharp cry of protest burst from her lips as he raised the sawtooth blade above his head. "Lazar!" The chief elder turned white and whirled around, chuckling nervously as he saw Hamad limping up from the pool. "Hamad, my son! What are you doing here?" His face darkened as he saw the curved sword in his hand. "What is this? How is it even possible? I drugged the wine and stew. It would have put an elephant to sleep." "Yes," said Hamad. "With the purple juice of the Ninda lily, you failed to take into account that I used the Ninda lily to ease the painful spasms that seize my missing leg. Though it's gone, I still feel it, and it often cramps up in the night, causing me to wake up in terrible agony. The Ninda lily has been my relief, but over the years I've built up a tolerance to it, and have had to increase my dosage. Had you laced our food with anything else, I would be slumbering unwakeably like the others." Lazar's face flashed with anger. "And you followed me through the swamp? I'm surprised you didn't faint from fear. It isn't like you to have a backbone." "Let her go, Lazar." "Or what? You're going to turn your blade on me? I gave you my youngest daughter as your wife. I made you guard captain of Caradon. And after that crocodile ripped your leg off, I took you into my house and fed you from my own table. You've got some nerve." Lazar set the dagger at the foot of the altar and drew his own sword. "Well then, come at me, boy." Caga watched in dismay as Hamad hobbled forward on his crutch, and Lazar burst into mocking laughter. "Hamad, don't do this, my son. You're only half a man. Look at you, hopping around on one foot. You think you're going to fight me? I'll chop your other leg off." But the former guard captain struck with lightning-bolt agility, and Lazar yelped as the quick thrust caught his outer arm. "Hamad," he hissed, clutching his searing limb. "You're a dead man." "Consider that a warning. Now let the sister go." Eyes smoldering, Lazar lunged at him with a shout, his sword flashing in a vicious arc, and a succession of piercing clangs rang throughout the altar room. Sharpened steel sheared and sang, whirling blades clashed in pink bolts of lightning, and in the shivering glow of the lanterns, giant shadows struck and parried on the wall. Distracted by Hamad's unexpected appearance, Lazar had absent-mindedly left the dagger on the altar, and as the two men fought, Caga sat up, swung herself around, and fumbled awkwardly for the blade with her bound hands. She managed to get a hold of the serrated knife between her wiggling fingers, but as she tried to saw through the rough rope, she lost her grip and the dagger clattered to the ground. Caga stifled an exasperated oath. The two combatants were still locked in the furious motions of their deadly duel. Lazar's right hand was red and dripping. Eyes blazing, his face contorted with wrath, he advanced, his sword descending in harsh, glimmering strokes. Hamad grunted and hissed, warding off the malicious assault with terse lashes of his blade and stiff knocks from his crutch. Caga shifted off the altar. Squatting down, she felt again for the sawtooth dagger and set to cutting through her bonds. She had not yet freed herself when a sharp, gurgled cry rang awfully throughout the altar room. Her blood froze, and she stared in horror at the two men. They had ceased their violent movements and stood statue-like near the edge of the platform. At first she thought they had run each other through. Then Lazar stepped back, chuckling nervously, blood trickling from his scarlet hand. Hamad's eyes bulged in a mix of shock and agony. Lazar's sword was buried halfway in his chest. Hamad stared down at the red-stained hilt, shuddered, and retched up dark clots of blood.
His crutch fell aside as he staggered back on his one leg. The light dimmed in his gawking eyes. He reached out his arm, reeled backwards off the edge of the platform, and splashed into the pool, dead. Chapter 7. Caga's chest heaved with a terrified sob. With a desperate cry, she rushed at Lazar with the dagger, fully intending to plunge it into his corrupted heart. But Lazar caught her by the wrist and sent her sprawling with a hard clap from the back of his hand. Growling a slew of oaths, he seized her by her dark curls, and Caga wept with despair as he dragged her back toward the altar. Then Lazar paused, cocking his ear. Caga too went silent as she listened with fearful curiosity. A slippery, squishing sound was coming from the orange, gel-like substance covering the wall. They both froze stiff as something splashed into the pool. "Could it be," said Lazar, his voice strained with fear, "that the Lord has woken? But I have not yet offered the sacrifice. I don't understand." But Caga did. Water swished and sloshed unseen in the dark shadows beneath the altar platform. Whatever thing had dropped into the pool was now swimming, seemingly with awkward difficulty, to the place where Hamad had fallen. His blood had mingled with the water and enticed it from its embryonic membrane. Caga's hair rose stiff from her shoulders as a horrific croaking echoed up from the black pool. But the sounds she heard next truly chilled her blood. Dull, wet scrapes, the snap of bones and popping tendons, then awful, slurping smacks, and the hideous, panting grunts of an insatiable creature gorging itself for the first time in its abominable life. It was meant to gorge itself on her. It was not without reason Lazar had chosen her for the sacrifice. Like Suor and Umatari, all creation, even the dread goddess Tamurot, was bound by the currency of life, the joining of the two complementary natures, male and female. In the same way Suor had only female priestesses, and his consort Umatari had only male priests, in the same way heaven and earth were united in the marriage of their son Belshuar with his human queen, this thing was meant to feast on the flesh of a virgin woman for its sustenance. In its vulnerable, weak state, for this newborn male deity to consume the flesh of another male being was to short-circuit its life force. More wretched croaking resounded from below. This time, a shrill call of distress and confused frustration. Caga dared to hope this mishap would be the end of whatever was in the pool. There was a sluggish thrashing in the water, then dead quiet. Caga held her breath. Lazar stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. With a slow, squishy slapping, a dark humanoid form lumbered up into the pinkish glare. It was monstrous to behold. The stout body was coated in slick gray scales. Spiked fins protruded from the spine and dangling arms. From the webbed feet and hands extended long red claws. The broad, bald head bulged from neckless shoulders, presenting small, round shark eyes that glistened like black beads. The sunken nostrils of a reptilian creature and fat, frog-like lips drawn back from a gnarled mess of gory teeth. "Behold him," said Lazar. "Behold he who shall rule over earth, and see." This grotesque abomination was the son of Tamurot, the demonic horror god who would usurp the throne of Belshuar and drown the earth in a tidal wave of death and chaos. All humanity would be consumed in the crimson flood of his unholy reign, and there would be no end to the agony and torment he would inflict upon his enslaved subjects. Through him, the goddess of the deep would at long last have her revenge. Caga was too horrified to scream. But as the thing stepped toward them, it slumped over on one knee, moaning hideously as though suffering from some terrible affliction. "No, no!" cried Lazar, finally understanding what had gone awry. He rushed from her side to help the monster, speaking softly as if to comfort a sick child. "My lord, come, my lord. You should not have eaten him odd. His flesh has made you weak. But here, it is only a short way. Here is the virgin girl who was meant for your sacrifice. Come, my lord." Caga was sick with dread. It would have been far better for Lazar to kill her on the altar than for those gnarled teeth to tear into her naked flesh while she was still alive. Perhaps, if she threw herself at the altar, she could smash her skull with enough force to kill herself before the monstrosity snatched her in its webbed claws, or at least knock herself senseless, so she would not be awake to endure the gruesome feasting. But as Lazar stooped to help the creature to its feet, a terrible thing took place. Its superior mind scrambled into retardation after ingesting male flesh and blood. The creature sought to revitalize itself with the first food it had known, the flesh of a man. Chapter 8. Even in its feeble state, the weakened deity sprung off the ground with terrifying speed. Lazar squawked in surprise as it caught him in its dreadful embrace, then shrieked in terrible agony as long teeth sunk into his shoulder, and hooked claws raked his body with the frantic impatience of a child tearing open a long-awaited gift. Caga stood frozen as the thing fed voraciously upon the chief elder of Caradon. Lazar's screams turned into gurgles, then to silence, and his limp body jerked under the creature's hungry movements. But the more it ate, the less it seemed satisfied, and again came that shrill croak of frustration. At last it lifted its dripping chin and fixed its black eyes on the young priestess. It was now too weak to stand, and with an awful groan, it reached its webbed hands out towards her, pulling itself forward on its belly. With a disgusted whimper, Caga backed away from the crawling wretch, knocking her heel against her discarded water gourd. Perhaps once it reached its strength, this abominable godling would be able to withstand the pure fresh water of a glacial spring. But in its short life, it had only known the brackish water of the corrupted pool, and it was sorely weakened. The cool water in the gourd would likely be highly caustic to its newborn skin. Caga snatched up the gourd, plucked out the stopper, and scowling with terrified repulsion, dumped the sparkling liquid in great glugs onto the creature's head. A high-pitched squeal arose from the pathetic, writhing form with white tendrils of steam and the whistle of sizzling meat. Most of its face had melted off, but it was still alive. With a horrid spasm, it lashed out and caught her by the ankle, its mouth working mechanically as it dragged itself toward her. With a scream, Caga kicked it between the eyes and struggled free of its long-nailed clutch. Scrambling for the nearest weapon, she leapt upright with her priestess's staff. "Abomination!" she yelled. "By the name of the true god Suor, I expel you from this holy place!" With a sharp cry, Caga thrust down the butt of her staff with all her might and staved in the creature's skull. At the bottom of the sea, Tamurot pitched forward and tore her slime-weed hair. Her anguished wail shuddered the ocean depths. Far above, green waves thrashed and writhed. The black heavens shook and thundered, scourging the sea with bright, sudden lashes. With the shrieks of a burning witch, the goddess of the deep reeled and jerked like a hooked marlin, then plunged into the deepest trench in the ocean. After 1,000 years of brooding in the dark, waiting with long-suffering patience as she slowly regathered her power, after all her meticulous planning, bribery, seduction, and countless sacrifices, she had been overcome by an innocent girl. The rising sun cast a red-gold tint over the swamp when Father Sakazar, Mashti, and the men of Caradon awakened from their drug-induced slumber and sculled their boats with anxious haste towards the ziggurat. With 2 men and 2 boats missing, The old priest imagined with gut-wrenching dread what scene might await them at the temple. He cursed himself for not stopping the vigil. He'd had a bad feeling. Why hadn't he stopped it? He swore under his breath when he saw the 2 empty vessels floating outside the temple. "Caga!" he shouted, splashing into the shallow waters of the landing. "Sister Caga!" Mashti was close behind him, her face expressionless and grim, her knobbed iron club poised to crush the skull of any man or beast who dared to violate her charge. But as Father Sakazar pulled himself up onto the bottom step of the ziggurat, there was a blinding glimmer of light from above, and shouts of applause from the men behind. At the temple summit, her green eyes sparkling in the morning light, the gold head of her staff glittering in the sunrise, was Sister Caga, though she was Sister Caga no longer. She was Mother Cagarashti, priestess of Suor. This has been Saltwater Magic, written and narrated by Timothy J. R. Raines.